The air of the Holy Land on that November day in the year 1177 was thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of parched grass, the sweat of thousands, and the icy metallic premonition of death. On the field near the hills of Montgisard, time itself seemed to freeze, becoming a taut string on a giant bow, ready to release its deadly arrow. On one side, a boundless sea of steel, silk, and banners shimmered under the sun. The army of Saladin, the conqueror of Syria and Egypt, the greatest warrior of Islam since the Prophet. There were over 26,000 of them. Elite cavalry, infantry hardened in dozens of battles, and fierce volunteers thirsting for holy war. They were like a swarm of locusts, poised to devour what little remained of the Christian world in the East. And on the other side, at the foot of the hill, stood a mere handful, a mockery of an army. Fewer than 400 knights and a few thousand foot soldiers, the remnants of garrisons, gathered in a desperate haste. At their center, in a place of honor, stood not siege engines or a general's throne, but a simple litter. On it, wrapped in cloth to hide the sores of leprosy, lay a 16-year-old boy, Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem. A mask concealed his face, but even through it, one could feel an aura of unbreakable will, transforming the scene from a tragedy into the prelude of an epic. Here on this scorched field, the greatest paradox of the age was laid bare. A dying body that held a fire capable of incinerating armies. And the ultimate question, hanging silently in the searing air, was not who would win. The answer seemed obvious. But how this sick, doomed boy dared to challenge fate itself and the invincible Sultan. To understand how this mad venture became possible, one must see the world through the eyes of the 12th century, on a geopolitical chessboard where every piece was soaked in blood and faith. The Crusader states, known as Outremer, were a thin, fragile strip of Christian land on a hostile coast. They were an island, washed on all sides by an ocean of Islam. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the very heart of this world, was not a monolithic power, but a federation of mighty and willful barons, each nearly a king in his own castle. The county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Edessa, all were parts of a patchwork quilt, hastily stitched together by the swords of the First Crusade and constantly tearing at the seams from internal strife and external threats. Their very existence was a miracle, a daily defiance of geography and demography. Meanwhile, a tectonic shift was occurring in the Muslim East. From the ashes of fractured caliphates and emirates, a new, fearsome power was rising. The Kurdish warlord Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in Europe as Saladin, was methodically, step by step, uniting the Muslim lands under his rule. He first became the absolute master of Egypt. Then, after the death of his patron Nur al-Din, he subjugated Syria. For the first time in decades, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was caught in a vice between two parts of a single empire, ruled by one man whose proclaimed goal was to expel the Franks and return the holy city, Al-Quds, to the shadow of the crescent moon. This was no longer a mere threat of border skirmishes. It was the dawn of a total war of annihilation. The fragile system of checks and balances that had allowed the kingdom to survive had collapsed. It was now a question not of if, but of when Saladin's hammer would fall upon the Christian enclave. And at the very heart of this vulnerable world, in the royal palace of Jerusalem, the ticking clock of fate was measuring not years, but the short, painful months of a young monarch's life, who was destined to face this storm. The heir to this doomed paradise, Baldwin was born in 1161 to King Amalric I of the House of Anjou, a line of adventurers, warriors, and rulers whose blood flowed in the veins of kings in both England and Jerusalem. He carried the legacy of his ancestors, Godfrey of Bouillon, Baldwin I, the legendary leaders of the First Crusade who had carved the Holy Land from the hands of infidels at the point of a sword. From birth, great hopes were placed upon him. He was a handsome, intelligent, and promising boy, destined to strengthen and expand the work of his great-grandfathers. The kingdom desperately needed a strong ruler, a new hero capable of uniting the ever-feuding barons and repelling the growing power of Islam. But a shadow, unseen and merciless, was already gathering over the prince's cradle. It was not the shadow of a political plot or a dynastic curse, but something far worse, a biological time bomb planted within his own body. Leprosy, the scourge of the Middle Ages, a disease that didn't just kill, but turned a person into a living corpse, an outcast, unclean in the eyes of God and man. In an era when physical strength and beauty were seen as a reflection of divine grace, and deformity and illness as the mark of sin, such an affliction for an heir to the throne was tantamount to a death sentence, not only for him but for the entire kingdom. The very idea of a leper king seemed a monstrous oxymoron, a cruel mockery of fate. This shadow, at first unnoticed, grew with the boy, preparing one day to reveal itself to the world and call into question not only Baldwin's right to the throne, but the divine right of the kingdom of Jerusalem to exist at all. The terrible truth was revealed not through court intrigue or a council of physicians, but during a simple childhood game, lending the moment a touch of Greek tragedy. The young prince's tutor, William of Tyre, one of the greatest historians of his age, had been observing his student with growing concern. He described how Prince Baldwin and his peers, the sons of the kingdom's noblest barons, would amuse themselves with mock battles. A common game for boys destined to become knights was to pinch and dig their nails into each other's arms and forearms, competing to see who could endure the pain the longest. William noticed a strange and frightening detail. While the other boys would cry out and pull their arms away, Baldwin endured everything with an unruffled stoicism that seemed almost supernatural. At first, the tutor attributed it to exceptional fortitude and courage, worthy of a future king. But when he saw that the prince seemed to feel no pain at all, even when his companions, in the heat of the game, inflicted serious scratches, a chilling dread entered his heart. He approached the boy, took his right hand, the very hand that would one day hold a scepter and a sword, and tried to pinch it himself, then prick it. There was no reaction. The boy looked at his tutor with bewilderment, not understanding the cause for his concern. For Baldwin, this was normal. For William of Tyre, it was a diagnosis delivered by fate itself. The absence of pain was not a sign of strength, but the first, surest symptom of anesthetic leprosy. In that moment, the brilliant future of the heir to the throne crumbled, and his long, agonizing struggle began. Not for glory, but for every day, every hour of a dignified existence. The episode became a prophecy. The boy who could not feel physical pain was doomed to experience the full measure of spiritual and political suffering that could ever befall a monarch. From the moment the terrible diagnosis became an undeniable reality, young Baldwin's life turned into a desperate race against time. His body became his prison, and the progressing disease a merciless jailer, tightening its chains with each passing day. But it was in these hellish conditions that his true weapon was forged. Not the sword, which his hand could now barely hold, but his intellect and his will. William of Tyre, realizing that physical strength had left his student forever, redoubled his efforts to turn his mind into an unbreakable fortress. The prince's education ceased to be routine and became a mission. Every day was precious. While his peers practiced with sword and spear, Baldwin stormed the bastions of knowledge. He devoured the works of ancient historians, studying the tactics of Alexander the Great and the strategy of Hannibal. He delved into the complex intricacies of Byzantine diplomacy, understanding that for his kingdom, the ability to negotiate was more important than the ability to fight. He listened to the stories of old crusaders, absorbing their experience of survival in the desert, their knowledge of Arabic, and the customs of the enemy. His mind became a battlefield where he won his first victories. The disease, while stealing the joys of youth, sharpened his intellect and perception. He learned to see what others missed, the hidden motives in ambassadors' words, the vulnerabilities in the boasts of his barons, the subtlest nuances of the political game. He knew he could not lead knights into a charge, relying on personal valor like his father Amalric or his grandfather Fulk. His strength had to be foresight, calculation, and the ability to manipulate men. This crucible of character, where the hammer was pain and the anvil was the awareness of his own impending death, forged the sick boy into a steel-willed ruler, whose intellectual and volitional power far exceeded the limits of his decaying body. In July of 1174, King Amalric I died, and the burden of the crown of Jerusalem fell upon the frail shoulders of his 13-year-old son. The coronation of Baldwin IV in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was a spectacle filled with tragic grandeur and ominous portents. The young boy, already visibly marked by his illness but with his head held high, accepted the symbols of power that everyone believed he could not possibly hold. For many of the kingdom's barons, his ascension was not the start of a new reign, but the beginning of the end. They saw not a king, but a vacant throne. A leprous monarch, in their view, could not be God's anointed. His disease was a sign of divine displeasure, a terrible omen for the entire Holy Land. Immediately, a clandestine struggle for the regency and real power began. The court became a nest of vipers, with everyone trying to carve out a larger piece for themselves. On one side was Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, the king's closest male relative, a cunning and experienced politician who saw himself as the rightful guardian of the throne. On the other was the kingdom's seneschal, Miles of Plancy, the late king's favorite, who held the reins of the administration. Baldwin found himself caught between a rock and a hard place. His first battle unfolded not on the Saracen frontier, but in the halls of his own palace. And it was here that he first revealed his iron grip. Instead of becoming a pawn in someone else's game, he began to skillfully play his guardians against each other, using their ambitions to his advantage, slowly but surely seizing the real levers of power. He attended every meeting of the High Council, asking uncomfortable questions, demonstrating a grasp of state and military affairs astonishing for his age. He made it clear to everyone that, despite his disease, he was the king, and the final word was his. This first bloodless victory over his own court was perhaps as crucial as his future military triumphs. It showed that beneath the disfigured shell was not a broken child, but a formidable and discerning ruler. Behind the outward displays of royal authority, behind the council meetings and receptions for ambassadors, lay a deeply personal, secret motivation that fueled his fading life. Unlike many monarchs driven by a thirst for glory, wealth, or conquest, Baldwin was propelled by the most powerful incentive of all, the awareness of his own approaching end. His inner demon was time itself, slipping like sand through his fingers with every new sore, every bout of fever, every dying nerve ending. He harbored no illusions of a miraculous cure. He knew he was doomed. This certainty of a swift and painful death freed him from petty human passions and focused his colossal will on a single goal: to leave behind a kingdom capable of surviving without him. His reign became a desperate, feverish race for immortality, not for himself, but for his cause, for Jerusalem. He had to solve an impossible problem in the short time allotted to him: strengthen the defenses, reconcile the warring factions, find a worthy successor, and most importantly, strike a blow against Saladin so powerful it would make him abandon any thought of destroying Outremer for years to come. Every decree, every military campaign, every diplomatic maneuver was dictated by this desperate desire to buy time for his people. He understood that his sister Sibylla, the heir to the throne, was a weak and easily influenced woman, and her choice of husband could either save or ruin the kingdom. This is why he interfered so fiercely in her personal life, trying to find her a spouse who could be a reliable defender of the throne. This fight for the future was his personal crusade, one he waged alone, in the silence of his chambers, when the pain and despair became almost unbearable. It was this all-consuming mission, this thirst to leave a lasting legacy, that transformed the sick youth into a titan, capable of deeds that seemed impossible for healthy and strong men. Coming into his own at the age of 15 and formally ending the regency, Baldwin immediately showed that his crown was not merely a symbol. He began to rule with an iron fist, clad in a glove rotting from leprosy. He understood that any display of weakness would be seen by the predatory barons and foreign enemies as an invitation to attack. His first independent actions were therefore defiantly bold. He refused to ratify a peace treaty his regent, Raymond of Tripoli, had made with Saladin, viewing it as humiliating and short-sighted. Instead, he personally led a military raid into the Bekaa Valley, launching a daring preemptive strike against the forces of the Emir of Damascus. This campaign, though it didn't lead to a major battle, showed everyone, friend and foe alike, that the young king, despite his illness, was a fully fledged military leader, unafraid to take risks and assume responsibility. He didn't hide away in Jerusalem, but appeared among his troops, his litter or specially equipped saddle becoming a mobile command post. His presence on the battlefield had a colossal moral impact on his soldiers. The sight of their young, suffering monarch, ready to share every hardship of the campaign, turned ordinary soldiers into ferocious defenders of their king and their faith. Moreover, Baldwin proved himself a shrewd politician. He skillfully navigated between the interests of the local barons and the powerful military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, using their rivalry to strengthen his own authority. He understood that only a royal power standing above all factions could unite the kingdom's scattered forces against a mortal threat. These first years of his reign shattered the image of a helpless, sick child and created a new one, that of a wise and resolute ruler, whose physical affliction only highlighted the incredible strength of his spirit. While Baldwin desperately tried to consolidate his fragile kingdom, a giant, ominous crescent moon was rising on the horizon. The power confronting the Crusaders was growing at a terrifying rate, and its name was Saladin. He was not like the previous Muslim rulers, who were divided and often fought each other more than they fought the Franks. Saladin was a brilliant strategist, a subtle diplomat, and most importantly, a charismatic leader who managed to revive the idea of jihad, the holy war, to liberate the Holy Land. His ascent was swift and relentless, After establishing himself in Egypt as vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, he soon abolished the caliphate itself, returning Egypt to the spiritual authority of the Sunni caliph in Baghdad and becoming its absolute sultan. Then, after the death of his former master Nur al-Din, he turned his gaze to Syria. Using force in some places and skillful diplomacy in others, he subjugated Damascus, Aleppo, and other key cities within a few years. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem found itself strategically encircled. The two greatest centers of the Islamic world, Cairo and Damascus, were now in the hands of one man, obsessed with the idea of expelling the Christians. Saladin had created an empire stretching from Libya to Mesopotamia, and all the resources of this vast territory could now be thrown at a single goal. He reformed the army, creating a highly professional force with his personal Mamluk guard at its core, elite slave soldiers loyal to him unto death. He built a navy to challenge the Crusaders' maritime dominance. The threat was no longer local, it had become existential. For Baldwin and his kingdom, this meant that any mistake, any internal dispute, could be their last. The doomsday clock for Outremer had begun its final countdown. The first serious clashes between the two young leaders, Baldwin and Saladin, were a test of strength, an intellectual and spiritual duel that would define the future course of history. No longer a teenager, but still a very young man, Baldwin displayed astonishing tactical maturity. He understood that he could not afford to get drawn into pitched battles where Saladin's numerical superiority would be overwhelming. His strategy became one of pinpricks, of swift, daring raids and preemptive strikes. When Saladin besieged the powerful Crusader fortress of Kerak, east of the Dead Sea, which controlled the caravan routes, Baldwin, despite his deteriorating health, immediately marched with an army to its relief. His arrival was so swift and unexpected that it caught Saladin completely by surprise. The great Sultan, unwilling to risk his main army in unfavorable conditions and impressed by the young king's determination, chose to lift the siege and retreat. This was a huge moral victory for the Crusaders. Baldwin had proven that he could stand as an equal against the legendary commander. This episode sowed the first seeds of doubt and perhaps respect in Saladin's mind for his ailing opponent. He saw that behind the mask of disease was a mind as sharp as Damascus steel. Baldwin, in turn, studied his enemy's style, his penchant for large-scale operations, his caution, his reliance on supply lines. These tactical masterpieces, while not delivering a decisive victory, provided invaluable experience. They boosted the morale of the Frankish army and solidified Baldwin's authority as commander-in-chief. He was buying time, the most precious resource he had, and preparing for the inevitable ultimate confrontation. The success or failure of any monarch largely depends on the people around them, and the court of Baldwin IV was a true nest of vipers, where loyalty and betrayal, brilliance and madness were tightly interwoven. His inner circle was a kaleidoscope of vibrant and contradictory figures, each playing a fateful role in the kingdom's destiny. The main opponent, and yet a potential ally, was his cousin, Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. Experienced, calculating, and power-hungry, he considered himself the most worthy candidate for regent, and perhaps even king. His relationship with Baldwin was a complex mix of kinship, political rivalry, and mutual respect. A completely different figure was Reynald of Châtillon, Lord of Transjordan. An adventurer to the core, brave to the point of recklessness and pathologically greedy, he was a constant headache for the king. His pirate-like raids on Muslim caravans and pilgrims constantly violated fragile truces and provoked Saladin into retaliation, endangering the entire kingdom. However, his fortresses of Carac and Montreal were key bastions on the southern frontier. The military orders were a power unto themselves. The Templars and Hospitallers represented the most professional and disciplined part of the Crusader army. Fanatically devoted to defending the Holy Land, they answered directly to the Pope, which made them independent of royal authority. Baldwin had to use all his diplomatic skill to secure their support. And finally, the central figure around whom all intrigues were spun was his sister, Princess Sibylla. Since Baldwin could have no children, her husband was destined to inherit the throne. Her choice, dictated more by passion than political calculation, ultimately brought the inept Guy of Lusignan into the royal family, a decision that became the Achilles heel of the dynasty and one of the main reasons for the future catastrophe. Baldwin was forced to balance between these forces like a tightrope walker over an abyss, knowing that any false move could be the last for him and his kingdom. The autumn of 1177 became the moment of truth for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin, having completed the unification of Egypt and Syria and settled his internal affairs, decided the time had come for the decisive blow. He assembled a massive army, estimated at 26,000 to 30,000 warriors, and invaded the kingdom from the south, from Egypt. His plan was simple and effective. He knew that the main Frankish army, led by Philip, Count of Flanders, an influential European lord who had arrived in the Holy Land with his own contingent, was in the north, near Antioch, preparing for a campaign against Syrian cities. The kingdom's southern frontiers, including Jerusalem itself, were left virtually defenseless. Saladin moved quickly, bypassing border fortresses and striking directly at the heart of enemy territory. His target was Ascalon, a strategically vital port city, the capture of which would cut the kingdom off from the sea and open a direct road to Jerusalem. For Baldwin, the hour of impossible choices had arrived. He had at his disposal only a few hundred knights and a couple of thousand infantry, a pathetic handful compared to Saladin's horde. His advisors begged him to lock himself in Jerusalem or the Tower of David and wait, hoping for a miracle or for the army from the north to return in time. Any attempt at a field battle looked like pure suicide. But Baldwin understood what his barons did not. To surrender Ascalon without a fight was to give Saladin the key to the entire kingdom. A passive defense was merely a postponement of the inevitable defeat. And so, against all logic, against his own agonizing illness, the 16-year-old king made a decision that shocked both his enemies and his allies. He decided not to defend. He decided to attack. This was the crossroads of fate, where genius and madness walk hand in hand, and where a single choice can change the course of history forever. The key factor that ultimately led to the miracle at Montgisard was not only Baldwin's genius, but also a rare, uncharacteristic mistake by his great adversary. Saladin, one of the most cautious and astute commanders of his era, fell victim in this campaign to his own pride and contempt for the enemy. All the intelligence available to him screamed of an easy and swift victory. His spies reported that the main Frankish army was far to the north, and that only a sick boy king with a small personal guard remained in Jerusalem. He saw before him a kingdom that was leaderless and demoralized, an easy prey that was walking right into his hands. This confidence in his own superiority blinded him. He made the classic mistake of many great conquerors before him. He underestimated his opponent. As he advanced deep into the kingdom's territory, he failed to maintain proper march discipline. Confident that no one could stop him, he allowed his huge army to stretch out for miles. He sent a portion of his troops to plunder nearby villages, both to reward his soldiers and to sow panic among the populace. He did not conduct constant reconnaissance. He did not expect a surprise attack. In his mind, the campaign was already won. All that remained was to collect the spoils. The image of a 16-year-old leper, who by all accounts could barely be carried on a litter, simply did not compute with the image of a dangerous foe. He saw Baldwin not as a strategist, but as an object of pity and a symbol of the Christian world's decline. It was precisely this hubris, this arrogant disdain, that became the chink in his armor into which Baldwin would thrust his deadly blade. Saladin was preparing for a siege and a surrender, while his opponent was preparing a bloodbath for him on the open field. While the external enemy tightened around the kingdom like an iron band, its internal structures were cracking under the weight of ambition and mutual distrust. Even in the face of the mortal threat posed by Saladin's invasion, the Frankish barons could not forget their quarrels. The unity that was absolutely essential for survival remained an unattainable dream. Many feudal lords, especially those whose lands were far from Saladin's line of march, were in no hurry to send their troops to the king's aid, preferring to wait it out behind the walls of their own castles. The arrival in the Holy Land of Philip, Count of Flanders, an influential European noble with a strong army, became a source of further problems rather than a blessing. Philip, being Baldwin's cousin, immediately laid claim to the regency and command of the combined army, which provoked sharp opposition from both the king himself and the local nobility. These disputes and intrigues meant that precious time was wasted. The army, instead of meeting Saladin in the south as a unified force, became bogged down in fruitless debates and pointless maneuvers in the north. This division was the clearest omen of the coming storm. It exposed the primary, systemic vulnerability of Outremer. A shortage of men and resources was compounded by a chronic inability to unite, even in the face of total annihilation. When Baldwin made his fateful decision to march from Jerusalem, he was practically alone. He could not count on immediate help from the squabbling northern army. He could rely only on a handful of loyal men, on the knights of the military orders, and on his own brilliant mind. This isolation made his act even more daring and desperate. He was marching into battle not only against Saladin, but against the foolishness and selfishness of his own people. It was in this atmosphere of near total hopelessness that Baldwin committed his fateful act, an act that historians to this day consider either a display of supreme strategic genius or one of pure madness. Rejecting all advice for a passive defense, he ordered his tiny army to march out of Jerusalem. This was not just a military decision, it was a challenge thrown down to logic, to fate, and to death itself. At his command were, by the most optimistic estimates, about 375 knights, including a contingent of 80 Templars under their Grand Master, Odo of Saint-Amand, and a few thousand infantry. With this force, he intended to attack an army that outnumbered his own almost 10-1. The march from Jerusalem to the coast, towards Ascalon, was a march of the doomed. Every step took them further from the safety of the capital's stone walls and closer to what seemed an inevitable slaughter. But there was a method to this madness. Baldwin understood his enemy's psychology. He knew that Saladin, upon hearing that the leper king had left Jerusalem with a handful of soldiers, would only become more convinced of the Franks' utter helplessness. The move had to look like a gesture of desperation, the last agony of a defeated foe. In reality, it was the opening move in a brilliant game of chess. Baldwin's goal was not simply to reach Ascalon to reinforce its garrison. His true design was far deeper and more cunning. He wanted to force a battle with Saladin where he wanted it, and when Saladin was least prepared for it. He was turning his weakness into a weapon, using it as bait to lure the overconfident predator into a trap. This forced march was the embodiment of his character, an unbending will, a contempt for physical pain, and a readiness to risk everything for a single purpose. He was leading his men not to their deaths, but to glory, though at that moment, no one believed it but him. The road from Jerusalem to Ascalon became for Baldwin not only a strategic maneuver, but a personal Calvary. Every mile of that journey was an act of overcoming unbearable physical pain. By then, leprosy had already inflicted terrible damage on his body. His limbs were covered in sores. His nerve endings had atrophied, causing a loss of sensation. Yet his internal organs and bones were tormented by a constant, debilitating ache. Fever was his constant companion. He could no longer sit unaided in a saddle, so he was either supported by squires or carried on a special litter that served as his throne, his command post, and his sickbed. One can only imagine what was going through the mind of this 16-year-old. Around him, a handful of loyal soldiers, marching to their certain deaths on his command. Ahead, the multi-thousand-strong army of one of the world's greatest generals, and within him, a merciless enemy that ravaged his flesh day and night. Anyone else in his place would have fallen into despair or apathy. But Baldwin fought his internal battle with the same tenacity as the external one. His mind, untouched by the disease, worked with a feverish clarity. Lying on his litter, he continued to issue orders, study scout reports, analyze Saladin's possible routes, and search for the perfect location for the coming battle. This image, a suffering, dying king leading his army into battle, made an indelible impression on his soldiers. His courage became their courage. His endurance multiplied their strength. They saw before them not just a monarch, but a living martyr, a holy warrior, and they were ready to die for him. Thus, his physical frailty, paradoxically, became a source of immense moral power, which forged this small army into a single, unbreakable monolith. Baldwin's strategic design was brilliant in its simplicity and audacity. He had no intention of merely fighting his way to Ascalon to lock himself inside and await a siege. He knew that would only prolong the agony. His plan was to drive the wolf into a trap, using Ascalon itself as the bait. By moving at a forced march, he outpaced Saladin's main forces and linked up with the city's garrison. To Saladin, this looked like the final victory. He had successfully cornered the enemy's main force in a coastal fortress. Now, all that was left was to encircle the city and wait for its inevitable fall. Jerusalem was defenseless. The road to it was open. Confident that the game was won, the Sultan sent a large part of his army to plunder the surrounding area, including the wealthy town of Ramla. He left only a minimal force at Ascalon to maintain the blockade, while he, with the core of his army, moved leisurely towards Jerusalem, anticipating his triumph. This was exactly what Baldwin had been waiting for. He used his opponent's psychology against him. He allowed Saladin to believe he had him trapped. Meanwhile, reinforced by the Ascalon garrison, and crucially, by the Templars who had also reached the city, Baldwin prepared to strike. As soon as his scouts reported that Saladin's army was strung out and had lost its battle formation, he gave the order. The small Crusader army surged from the gates of Ascalon and smashed into the rear of Saladin's scattered and unsuspecting forces. It was a maneuver worthy of Hannibal, turning one's own encirclement into a tactical advantage, striking where it was least expected, and transforming the enemy's numerical superiority into a weakness, as the dispersed army could not quickly rally into a cohesive whole. In this great game, Baldwin's masterstroke, which he played with the brilliance of a genius actor, was his own physical frailty. In an age when a commander's leadership and authority were directly tied to his personal valor and physical strength, the image of a leper king, unable even to hold a sword, evoked not fear in his enemy, but contempt and pity. Saladin, raised in the traditions of Islamic chivalry where martial prowess was paramount, simply could not take such an opponent seriously. He saw not a strategic equal, but a pathetic, sick child who had stumbled onto a throne. This fundamental underestimation was the cornerstone of Baldwin's entire strategy. He did not try to hide his disease. On the contrary, he made it his shield and his banner. He allowed rumors of his dreadful condition to spread freely, lulling his enemy into a false sense of security. When Saladin learned that this pitiful army had left Jerusalem, he likely saw it as an act of collective suicide or divine madness. He could not imagine that behind this smokescreen of physical decay was a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless mind, capable of the most daring gambit. Baldwin turned his tragedy into a masquerade. He wore a mask not just to hide his disfigured face, but to hide his true intentions. And Saladin, like everyone else, fell for it. He saw only the outer shell, the rotting flesh, the litter, the bandages, and failed to see the steel will and brilliant intellect within. That mistake cost him an army. Baldwin proved that on the battlefield, what matters most is not the strength of muscle, but the strength of mind, and that the most dangerous opponent is the one you deem the most insignificant. At the vanguard of Baldwin's suicidal charge stood a force that inspired terror and awe in even the most hardened warriors of the age. The Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. These warrior monks were the elite of the elite, the special forces of the medieval world. There were only about 80 of them, but each was worth 10 ordinary soldiers. Unlike secular knights, driven by a thirst for glory, plunder, or feudal duty, the Templars were moved by religious fanaticism in its purest, most distilled form. For them, life was merely a prelude to eternal bliss, and death in battle against the infidels was the shortest and surest path to paradise. They knew no fear, because they did not cling to life. Their iron discipline, honed by years of training, was unprecedented. In battle, they acted as a single organism, an armored fist that crushed everything in its path. Their famous tactic was a swift, compact wedge formation charge that could break through any enemy line, no matter how dense. Leading the Templars at Montgisard was their Grand Master, Odo of Saint-Amand, a man who was stern, proud, and unyielding. His presence guaranteed the knights would fight with doubled fury. For Baldwin, the Templars were his primary strategic reserve, his silver bullet. He understood that his small army could not withstand a prolonged fight. They had a chance for only one devastating blow. And it was the Templars who were to be the tip of that spear, the battering ram that would shatter Saladin's defenses and sow panic in his ranks. Their readiness to die, their contempt for death, transformed them from mere soldiers into a weapon of mass destruction, and Baldwin, the brilliant commander, intended to use this weapon with maximum effect. Beyond tactical genius and martial prowess, there was another, irrational but immensely powerful factor at play in the Battle of Montgisard, the power of faith, brought to a fever pitch. Before leading his tiny army into battle, Baldwin performed an act that transformed a military operation into a sacred rite. On his command, Ralph, the Bishop of Bethlehem, brought forth before the ranks the greatest relic of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragment of the true cross. This was the very cross on which Christians believed Jesus Christ was crucified. For the medieval mind, thoroughly steeped in religion, this was not merely a symbol. It was the physical presence of God on the battlefield. Legend says that the young king, struggling down from his litter, fell to his knees before the relic, tearfully praying to God for victory. This image, the suffering, dying anointed of God, praying before the cross for his people, had an electrifying psychological effect on the soldiers. They were seized by a fit of religious ecstasy. The fear of death vanished, replaced by a fanatical resolve. They were no longer just soldiers fighting for their king and their lands. They became the army of Christ, the warriors of the Lord, marching into a holy battle against the enemies of the faith. Their charge was now not just a tactical maneuver, but an act of worship. Every sword strike was a prayer, every drop of blood shed, a sacrifice. This spiritual mobilization turned a handful of men into an unstoppable avalanche. Saladin, with his huge but motley and complacent army, found himself facing an enemy who did not fear death and was utterly convinced of its divine mission. Baldwin had unwittingly unleashed the most powerful weapon of the era, faith, turning it into a real, tangible force capable of working miracles. A general's genius is shown not only in his ability to command troops, but also in his skill at using every element of his surroundings to his advantage. Baldwin IV demonstrated this talent to the fullest by choosing the ideal location for the decisive strike, the hills near the castle of Montgisard. After his rapid exit from Ascalon, he led his army along the coast and then turned sharply inland, aiming to intercept Saladin's main force, which, as he had correctly calculated, was moving in disarray towards Jerusalem. Saladin, caught by surprise, was forced to hastily gather his scattered units. The rallying point was an area near a small hill known as Tel Gezer or Montgisard. The terrain here was broken, hilly, and marshy after recent rains, which made maneuvering a large army, especially cavalry, extremely difficult. Saladin found himself at a disadvantage. His army was pinned between the hills and a swampy lowland, which deprived him of the ability to use his numerical superiority and his favorite tactic of flanking maneuvers. Baldwin, on the other hand, used the terrain as his ally. He concealed his main force behind the hills, leaving the enemy unaware of his exact numbers and position. Then, choosing the perfect moment when Saladin's army had not yet formed a proper battle line and was at its most vulnerable, he gave the order to attack. The Christian army, like an avalanche, crashed down from the hills onto the unprepared enemy. This downhill charge gave the cavalry attack extra power and momentum. Thus, the geography of the victory was just as important as the valor of the soldiers. Baldwin didn't just attack Saladin. He lured him onto unfavorable ground, neutralized his strengths, and maximized his own. It was not a mere brawl, but a perfectly executed tactical game, in which the hills and marshes fought on the side of the Crusaders. What happened next has entered the annals of military history as one of the most daring and incredible charges ever recorded. At the king's signal, with the bishop's blessing, the small Christian force plunged into what seemed a suicidal attack. Leading the way, in a wedge formation, 80 Knights Templar smashed into the enemy ranks, their white mantles with red crosses billowing like the wings of death's angels. Their target was Saladin's personal guard, the elite Mamluk warriors surrounding the Sultan. Behind them, gathering speed down the slope, surged the remaining 300 knights, heavily armored riders on powerful war horses. This armored battering ram, driven by fanaticism and desperation, slammed into the center of the Saracen army with such fury and force that the effect was like a lightning strike. The ranks of Saladin's warriors, caught off guard and out of formation, were instantly shattered and overthrown. The Crusader infantry followed the cavalry, finishing off the wounded and preventing the enemy from regrouping. Legends born that day tell of incredible feats of heroism. It is said that Baldwin himself, overcoming his pain, demanded to be carried in the front lines, and his presence, his litter bearing the royal standard, inspired the soldiers to acts of miraculous courage. The sight of their dying king, unafraid to share their mortal peril, multiplied their fury. The attack was so swift and devastating that Saladin's huge army, composed of veterans from many wars, simply had no time to realize what was happening. They were psychologically unprepared for such an onslaught. They had come to plunder, not to die. The blow landed directly at the heart of their army, at its command center, instantly paralyzing its leadership. This was the charge of the doomed, and that is precisely why it succeeded. They gambled everything, and fate rewarded their insane courage. The result of this swift assault surpassed the wildest expectations. Saladin's vast, seemingly invincible army devolved into an uncontrollable, panicking mob. The strike of the Templars and Knights was so precise and powerful that they broke through the lines and fell directly upon the Sultan's personal guard, 1,000 elite Mamluk warriors, the flower of the Egyptian army. In a brutal, bloody melee, the elite of Saladin's force was almost completely wiped out. The great Sultan himself, who moments before had been anticipating an easy victory and a triumphant entry into Jerusalem, came within a hair's breadth of death or shameful capture. According to Muslim chroniclers, he was so stunned and terrified that he was forced to flee on his fastest camel, abandoning his army, his banner, and his treasure. His flight was the signal for a total rout. Deprived of their commander and witnessing the slaughter of his finest guards, the rest of the army simply disintegrated. A stampede began, which soon turned into a massacre. The Crusader knights pursued and cut down the fleeing soldiers for miles. Thousands of Saracens were killed, many drowned in the marshes or were taken prisoner. Saladin's losses were catastrophic. By some estimates, he lost up to 90% of his force. His baggage train, weapons, banners all fell to the victors. This was not just a defeat, it was a complete and utter rout. The greatest humiliation Saladin would ever suffer in his military career. The miracle had happened. A sick, 16-year-old boy had crushed one of the greatest military commanders in history. News of this incredible victory spread like wildfire across the Middle East, giving birth to a legend that would endure for centuries. The victory at Montgisard, dazzling and miraculous, had its dark side. The miracle came at a heavy price, and its consequences were ambiguous. Yes, the invading army of Saladin had effectively ceased to exist. The immediate threat to Jerusalem was lifted. It would take Saladin nearly a year to recover from this devastating defeat and raise a new army. This gave the kingdom of Jerusalem a precious breathing spell, perhaps extending its existence by several years. The morale in the Christian camp soared, but the Crusader losses, though incomparably smaller than Saladin's in absolute numbers, were extremely painful. About 1,100 soldiers died in the battle, of whom, most grievously, about 750 were infantry, and several dozen were knights. For a small kingdom suffering from a chronic shortage of manpower, the loss of a single knight was a tragedy. These were experienced, battle-hardened warriors who were almost impossible to replace. Thus, by winning one decisive battle, the kingdom had weakened its overall military potential. Furthermore, Baldwin himself, whose mental and physical strain during the campaign had reached its limit, paid for the victory with his health. After the battle, his condition deteriorated sharply. The disease began to advance with a new, redoubled ferocity. The victory at Montgisard became his triumph and his curse, the peak of his glory and the beginning of his rapid physical decline. He saved his kingdom, but in doing so, he burned away the last of his own life force, sacrificing himself on the altar of this incredible victory. News of the Battle of Montgisard spread across the world like a thunderclap. In Christian Europe, which had grown accustomed to bleak news of constant defeats and retreats in the East, the report of the mighty Saladin's crushing rout was explosive. Chroniclers and troubadours celebrated the miracle near Ascalon in every possible way. At the center of these tales, which quickly became embellished with mythical details, was the figure of the young leper king. In an instant, Baldwin IV was transformed from the little-known ruler of a distant, exotic kingdom into a living legend, a symbol of Christian courage and divine providence. His disease was no longer a mark of a curse, but a sign of his chosenness, stigmata, that testified to his sanctity. Stories were told that at the battle's decisive moment, St. George himself appeared in the heavens to lead the Christian forces. In the Muslim world, the effect was the exact opposite. The defeat at Montgisard was a shock and a profound humiliation for Saladin and his followers. The great Sultan, the invincible warrior of jihad, had been put to flight by a sick boy. It dealt a serious blow to his prestige. However, Saladin was too wise a ruler not to learn from this defeat. He forever shed his arrogant contempt for the Franks, and especially for their young king. He realized he was dealing with a formidable and unpredictable adversary, whose genius could not be measured by his physical condition. From that day forward, he treated Baldwin with a deep, almost reverent respect, acknowledging him as an equal on the great chessboard of history. And so, on the bloody field of Montgisard, the legend of the Leper King was born, a tragic and majestic saga of how the mortal weakness of the flesh can be the source of the immortal glory of the spirit. History, however, is full of cruel irony. The greatest triumph of Baldwin IV's life, the victory that should have secured his kingdom's longevity, proved to be merely a brilliant flash before the onset of a long, hopeless darkness. Montgisard gave Jerusalem a reprieve, but it did not save it from the internal sickness that was far more terrible than the king's leprosy. This disease, the greed, selfishness, and ambition of the Frankish barons, continued to eat away at the state from within. As soon as the immediate threat passed, all the old feuds and intrigues flared up with renewed intensity. Baldwin, his physical strength sapped by the campaign of 1177, found it increasingly difficult to restrain these centrifugal forces. His authority, bolstered by the glory of Montgisard, was still immense, but his body betrayed him more each day. The question of succession remained the central problem. His sister Sibylla, against the king's wishes, married a handsome but utterly inept and weak-willed nobleman from Poitou, Guy of Lusignan. Baldwin saw his brother-in-law's incompetence and tried until the very end to remove him from power, even crowning his own young nephew, Baldwin V. But all his efforts were in vain. He had won the battle against Saladin, but he was losing the war against the foolishness and ambition of his own court. and therein lay the ultimate tragedy of his reign. He could defeat any external enemy, but he was powerless against the decay within. The glory of Montgisard turned out to be but gilded rot on the facade of a building doomed to collapse. The last years of Baldwin's life were a slow, agonizing decline, a tragic epilogue to his heroic saga. The disease, which had temporarily retreated under the force of his will during the Montgisard campaign, now took its revenge with redoubled cruelty. He went completely blind. Sores covered his entire body, robbing him of the ability to move. His hands and feet were disfigured beyond recognition. He became a living ruin, locked in the prison of his own flesh. Yet even in this state, confined to his bed, he continued to rule. His mind remained clear and sharp until the very end. Dignitaries, generals, and ambassadors would come to his bedside, and he, unable to see their faces, judging only by their voices, would continue to issue wise and measured orders, unraveling intrigues and holding his kingdom back from the abyss. It was an incredible, almost supernatural spectacle. A state governed by a voice emanating from beneath funeral shrouds. He fought to his last breath, trying to correct his sister's fatal mistake, to sideline the hated Guy of Lusignan, and to ensure a peaceful succession for his little nephew. In March of 1185, at the age of just 24, Baldwin IV, the leper king, died. His death marked the end of an era. The last great king of Jerusalem was gone, the final pillar that had supported the entire edifice of Outremer. With his passing, the power vacuum he had so desperately tried to prevent finally opened, and into that void rushed the chaos, folly, and betrayal that would lead the kingdom to its inglorious end. The legacy of Baldwin IV became clear almost immediately after his death, and it was a legacy proven by its absence. History vividly demonstrated that his genius, his will, and his authority had been the only cement holding the crumbling kingdom of Jerusalem together. After his death, events spiraled downward with terrifying speed. His sickly nephew, Baldwin V, died just a year later, and the crown, just as the leper king had feared, passed to his sister Sibylla, who immediately crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan. The Warhawk faction, led by the reckless Reynald of Châtillon, was given free rein. Another of Reynald's attacks on a Muslim caravan, in violation of a truce, gave Saladin the long-awaited pretext for a new, total war. In the summer of 1187, just 2 years after Baldwin's death, Saladin invaded the kingdom. Guy of Lusignan, displaying appalling incompetence, gathered the entire Crusader army and led it into the waterless desert, straight into a trap set by Saladin. At the Battle of Hattin, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was completely annihilated. King Guy himself was captured, and the true cross, the holiest relic, was seized by the Muslims. The catastrophe was total and final. Soon after, Jerusalem itself fell. The tragedy of Hattin became the most convincing and bitter monument to the greatness of Baldwin IV. It showed that he, the sick, dying youth, had been the one man who, for 10 years, had successfully stood against one of the greatest commanders in history. His legacy was not lands or a dynasty. His legacy was the void he left behind, a void that no one else could fill. So how was this miracle possible? How did a young leper king manage to crush the army of the great Saladin? Now, with all the threads of the narrative woven together, the answer to this central question becomes clear and multifaceted. The solution to the paradox lies not in a single factor, but in a unique, almost mystical alchemy of victory, in which several key elements were fused together. The first and foremost component was, without a doubt, the personal genius of Baldwin himself. His sharp, analytical mind, honed by years of suffering and the study of military history, allowed him to devise a flawless plan. He masterfully used his own physical frailty as a strategic deception, turning it from a weakness into a deadly weapon that lulled his enemy into complacency. The second element was Saladin's fatal error, his uncharacteristic pride and arrogance, which led him to disregard all the rules of military science and underestimate his opponent. He fell into the psychological trap set for him by a sick boy. The third, and perhaps decisive factor on the battlefield, was the suicidal valor and fanaticism of the Knights Templar. This armored fist, driven by a contempt for death, became the battering ram that breached the Saracen lines and decided the battle's outcome in its opening moments. The fourth component was the colossal spiritual uplift of the army, inspired by the presence of the true cross and the personal example of their martyr king. This religious ecstasy turned soldiers into fearless berserkers. And finally, the fifth element was geography. Baldwin's skillful use of the terrain, the hills of Montgisard, which allowed him to conceal his forces, neutralize the enemy's numerical advantage, and deliver a sudden, devastating blow. Thus, the paradox is resolved. The king's physical decay became a catalyst, setting off a chain reaction in which genius, arrogance, fanaticism, faith, and tactics merged into a single fiery whirlwind that incinerated an invincible army. The story of Baldwin IV transcends a simple description of a medieval battle or the biography of an exotic monarch. It becomes a timeless, universal myth about the triumph of the spirit over the frailties of the flesh, a hymn to the human will, capable of overcoming any physical limitation, no matter how unimaginable. In his figure, the paradox of weakness and strength reaches its zenith. His body was a map of his suffering, a battlefield where leprosy won its daily victories. But his spirit was an impregnable citadel that neither pain nor despair nor the fear of death could conquer. Baldwin teaches us that a person's true strength lies not in the power of their muscles or in their longevity, but in the clarity of their purpose and the indestructibility of their resolve. His story is a tragic poem about the greatness and solitude of a leader who sees further than others, but cannot compel the short-sighted to follow him. He saved his kingdom in a single battle, but he could not save it from itself, from its internal vices. His short, brilliant life, like that of a comet, leaves us with a profound and unsettling question. What matters more? One great victory that illuminates the world with the light of a miracle, or the slow, inexorable defeat in the struggle against human nature? Baldwin IV left behind no thriving dynasty, no unshakable borders. He left something far greater, a legend that will, for centuries, inspire those who find themselves facing the impossible, and serve as a reminder that even in the weakest of bodies, there can dwell a spirit capable of moving mountains and putting invincible armies to flight.